Professor Jean-François Legal from France. He will give 4 lectures on the topic planar maps.
Thank you. Okay, so I first would like to thank the organizers, in particular Misha and Dan, for giving me the opportunity to present these lectures in this beautiful city. And so maybe I will change a little bit the title of my lectures. So I will speak about random geometry. But of course there will be, as you will see, planar maps very soon. But maybe I will start with an introduction. So the general goal is to define models of random geometry in 2 dimensions. So it can be in the plane, or, well, it's more convenient, in fact, to consider the sphere. So S2 is a 2-dimensional sphere. And basically, we're going to start from discrete models. And discrete models is precisely what we call planar maps. And so what is a planar map? Maybe I will give a formal definition later, but a planar map is simply a graph drawn in the plane, or if you prefer, on the 2-dimensional sphere. And so to get a model of random geometry, we just choose such a graph at random in a certain class, in a way I will explain also later. And the idea is to take a very large graph on the sphere, chosen at random, and to say that in the limit where the size of the graph tends to infinity, it is close to a certain continuous model. Okay? So when the size of the graph tends to infinity, we expect to get, by a suitable passage to the limit, which I will also explain, a certain continuous model. And in fact, one of the main goals of my lectures is to present this continuous model, which is called the Brownian map. And also to explain that in some sense, this object is a universal object, meaning that it can be obtained as a limit of many different discrete models, many different random planar maps. So in a sense, this is very similar to Brownian motion. As you know, Brownian motion is a good model for a purely random curve, if you want. And it's universal in the sense that you can find many models of discrete random curves which converge after rescaling to Brownian motion. So here it's the same, but we are not dealing with curves. We are dealing with surfaces in some sense, or graphs can be interpreted as discrete surfaces, and in the limit we have a continuous random surface. Okay? So before I give more precise definitions, this is a bit vague for the moment, let me just mention that there are several motivations for studying this problem. And there are in particular motivations coming from theoretical physics. while physicists have been interested in defining also models of random geometry, and in particular in the setting of what is called the two-dimensional quantum gravity. And the way physicists try to define these models of random geometry is precisely to start from discrete objects, to start from graphs. Okay? So really this idea of considering graphs chosen at random goes back to the work of physicists, and in particular Polyakov, who was the very famous theoretical physicist in the 80s, and many others. Okay? So this is still the subject of active research, in fact, in theoretical physics. Okay? There are also motivations coming from combinatorics, okay? Because these planar maps, these graphs drawn on the sphere, are really important objects in combinatorics. Okay? So there are many natural questions you can ask from the combinatorial point of view, while, for instance, if you try to enumerate the planar maps, I will come back to that later. Okay? And for me, the main motivation comes from probability theory. You really want to define a kind of canonical random surface. Okay. Well, canonical in the sense, well, very similar to what you say when you say that Brownian motion is a kind of canonical random curve. Okay, if you want to think of a continuous curve chosen completely at random, well, the natural choice is Brownian motion for many reasons that you probably know. Okay, so this was a very, very brief list of motivations. And okay, I'm not really going to discuss much about, no, I will not say much about theoretical physics. I'm not really competent for that. Maybe there will be some combinatorics in the lectures, but not so many. I will concentrate on the probabilistic aspects. So perhaps I can start with a formal definition. So what is a planar map? So this is an embedding I give the formal definition and I will explain then of a finite connected graph in the two-dimensional sphere S2. And something which is very important is the fact that you are not really interested in the details of this embedding. So you view it up to orientation preserving homeomorphisms of the sphere. So essentially, you have a graph drawn on the sphere. Well, for me, it will be in the plane, on the blackboard, but you should think of it on the sphere. And for instance, I draw for you my favorite planar map. Okay, something like this. Okay. So you see you have vertices here, edges between certain pairs of vertices. And so you have this graph. You should think of it as drawn on the sphere. Okay? So something I should say immediately that in the language of combinatorics, this is what people call not a graph, but a multigraph. Okay? In the sense that you can have multiple edges. You see, for instance, between these two vertices, you have one edge here, another one here. So you can have two edges connecting the same two vertices. Or here you have this one and this one. Okay. Okay. And you could also have self-loops. You could have something like that, an edge like this. But in fact, in the cases I'm going to consider, there will be no such a self-loop. So maybe I don't mention that. But what's important is to realize that you can have, in fact, multiple edges like this. Okay? Okay, so that's the definition. So what can you notice? Well, there is something you can do with the planar map, which you cannot do with the general graph, which is not embedded. You can define the faces. Okay? So what are the faces? These are the you think of this as a, if you want, as a geographical map, and so you have countries which are bounded by the edges. Okay, so the faces are the countries, if you want. So they are the connected component of the complement of edges. Okay, so if you look at this example, you have 7 faces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the external one on my figure, because remember we are on the sphere, so in fact there is no external one. Okay, so you should think of this as drawn on the sphere. Okay, so here you have 7 faces. Okay, something which is important also is to define the degree of a face. So the degree of a face is essentially it's a number of edges in the boundary of the face. So to be more precise, I would say it's a number of edge sides. I will explain that in a while. In the boundary, well, I would say incident to the face. So you see, for instance, this face clearly is of degree 4. You have 4 edges in the boundary. But you should notice that this face here is also of degree 4. Okay, so you may think that it is only of degree 3 because you see 1, 2, 3 edges. But you really count edge sides. Okay, so each edge has 2 sides. And here the 2 sides of this edge, well, they touch, they are incident, if you want, to the same face. Okay, so really, this edge has to be counted twice in the degree of this face. Okay, so this is a convention. Okay, so in fact, in this example, you can check that all faces have degree 4. Okay, it's true for this one, also true for the external one. You can check it. Okay, so this is in fact what we will call a quadrangulation. Okay, so there are 2 special cases. Triangulations and quadrangulations. So this means that each face has degree, well, 3 in the case of a triangulation and 4 in the case of a quadrangulation. Okay? Mm-hmm. So in fact this is a quadrangulation. With 7 faces. Okay, so let me insist now on the fact that you view this object up to homomorphisms of the sphere. So this means that you can change a little bit the picture. You can move, if you want, a little bit the position of this vertex. You can put it here. Okay, something like that. It's still the same object. You can deform it continuously. Still will be the same object, or if you want, you can do that. Okay, so you can deform it by a homomorphism and orientation preserving homomorphism of the sphere. Okay. Some things you cannot do, on the other hand, you cannot, for instance, move this edge from outside the face where it lies. Okay, you cannot just erase that and put it here. This would be the same graph if you want. There would be no difference for the graph. But the planar map will be different. Okay? One way of seeing that is that the degree of the faces does not change if you make this, such a homeomorphism. But on the other hand, here, if I have moved this edge from this face here to the exterior here, then you see clearly you have changed the degree of this face. Now you have a face of degree 2 here, okay? Okay. Okay. So this is not allowed, of course. Okay. Okay, so, okay, if it's the first time you see that, you may be a little bit surprised, but don't worry. Later we will see ways of constructing planar maps, planar quadrangulations, and, well, it will be clear what I mean by this definition. Okay. So the difference you see between a graph, well, what people call a planar graph, for instance, is a graph that you can embed in the plane. Okay. In the case of a planar map, of course, it's a graph you can embed in the plane, but you also specify the embedding. Okay? So for the same graph, you can have many different embeddings which correspond to different planar maps. Okay? Okay. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to say. Perhaps one more definition, a bit technical. So the planar map is rooted. So what do I mean by a rooted planar map? This means that there is a distinguished edge which is also oriented. So the edges a priori are not oriented, but what you do, you specify one particular edge. For instance, it can be this one, and you orient it. For instance, I could decide to orient it this way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And of course, when you identify modulo orientation preserving homeomorphisms, you require that the homeomorphism preserves the root edge also. So this oriented edge will be called the root edge. Okay. And the origin will sometimes be called the root vertex. Okay. So in fact, I'm going to deal, maybe I should comment on this. I'm going to deal with rooted planar maps. This is also what people in combinatorics have been doing for a long time. And the reason is that rooting, well, introducing a root like this is a way to avoid symmetries. Okay? And when you are going to count random planar maps, well, the problem of symmetries is a bit annoying. And the fact that you put a root avoids this problem. Okay? Okay. So it's, in a sense, it's technical, but it's also quite important, in particular for enumeration purposes. Something which is purely technical, but that I will use, is the fact that you can also define what a rooted and pointed planar map is. So this means that you have the root edge, like this, and in addition, you also distinguish a particular vertex, for instance, this one. Okay? So root edge plus distinguished vertex. Okay. So the distinguished vertex can be any vertex. It can be the root vertex, for instance, no problem, but it can be any vertex of the map. Okay, so these are definitions. We will see later how we can use them. So, now let me make a comment about the numbers of vertices, edges, and faces. Well, there is a famous formula, which really I have to cite here in particular. This is Euler's formula. So Euler's formula says that there is a relation between the number of vertices. So if I call S the number of vertices, E the number of edges, and F the number of faces, Euler's formula says that S plus F minus E is always equal to 2. Okay? Okay, so for any planar map. So here, I'm going to deal with, particularly with the case of quadrangulations. So if I look at the quadrangulation with n faces, okay, well then f is equal to n. And there is also a relation between the number of edges and the number of faces. And this relation is the fact that for f is equal to E. So why is this relation? Well, you can count edges, or you can count edge sides, I would say, just by saying that, well, for each face, well, you have, because it's a quadrangulation, you have 4 edge sides incident to the face, okay? So for each face here, I count 4 edge sides. And how many edge sides do you have? You have twice the number of edges, okay? So if you multiply f by 4, you get the same as twice 2e, okay? Okay, so this gives you immediately that E is equal to 2f, so E is equal to 2n. And now you apply Euler's formula, which is here, and this gives you the value of S. Okay, so for a quadrangulation with n faces, you have n plus 2 vertices. You can check it here. You can check that you have 9 vertices, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? Okay. Something else I wanted to say. Well, you can count, enumerate the quadrangulations. So this will be important for me. I will write Qn for the set of all rooted quadrangulations with n faces. And there is an explicit formula for the cardinality of this object. Well, just perhaps one comment about that. The fact that this set is finite is really due to the fact that we've made this identification, okay? Modulo homomorphisms. If you want, there are only finitely many possible shapes for, say, a quadrangulation embedded on the sphere like this. Okay? And you can describe these shapes in many ways, and we will see later, in fact, a way of describing the possible shapes you have. Okay? So this set is finite, and we can compute explicitly its cardinality. It's twice over n plus 2 times 3 to the power n times a number which I write Cn, and Cn is a classical Catalan number, 1 over n plus 1 to n choose n, the binomial coefficient to n. So this is a Catalan number of order n. Okay. So this formula and many other formulas were derived by Tutt in the 60s. And, well, Tutt was maybe the first important mathematician to study planar maps in detail. Okay. Okay, so maybe I can also mention that if you look at what I do, will write Qn dot, this will be the same thing, but for rooted and pointed quadrangulation with n faces. Okay? Then, well, what is the cardinality of this set? Well, it's very easy to see, because when you add this extra distinguished vertex, well, you can choose it. It can be any vertex of the map. And you will get different objects each time. Okay? It's the fact, really, what I said before, that you kill the symmetries when you root a planar map. So there are, in fact, n plus 2 possibilities for choosing this distinguished vertex. Because remember that n plus 2 is the number of vertices. Okay? So this object is just n plus 2 times the cardinality of Qn. Okay?
I'm sorry, but if you have just a square,
okay,
Is it important really which of them is marked?
Okay, so if you have just a square, that's a quadrangulation with two faces.
Yes.
Okay, so the root vertex can be put here, for instance. The root edge can be this one. It doesn't matter. All this is the same. Okay, if you put it here, and even if you it from the other side, you could. It's the same if you put it like this also.
Yes, I can make a homomorphism which maps any edge to any edge.
Yeah. Mm.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So it doesn't matter. But the distinguished vertex, you see, when you choose a distinguished vertex, it will give you different choices. If you choose this one, this one, this one, and this one, they are all different. Okay, because yeah, you cannot find a homeomorphism. Well, just the homomorphism has to preserve the root edge, the oriented root edge. Okay, so all these choices are going to be different. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about it later if you want. Okay, so maybe I don't say more about that. So we will see later a proof, in fact, of this formula. You see, this formula is, in fact, well, this n+2 cancels with this one. And so the formula for the rooted and pointed case is simpler than this one. And, well, there are good reasons for that, in fact. Okay, so when did I start? Okay, I have time. So maybe a last comment about why do we need, why am I going to deal with quadrangulations? Well, quadrangulations are nice also because there is a bijection between general planar maps with n edges and quadrangulations and what is called Qn. Okay, I should say always they are always going to be rooted. Okay, general rooted planar maps with n edges and Qn, my set of quadrangulations. Okay, so if I start from a general planar map, maybe I will take a very simple example. Okay, maybe something like this. Something like this, maybe this also. Okay, let's take this one. It's very simple. So you have, this is not a quadrangulation. You have a face of degree 3, one of degree 4, one of degree 2. Okay, and what you can do, you can construct from this object a quadrangulation. And how do you do that? You add in each face a red vertex like this, and also in the external face, of course. And then you add also red edges that connect this red vertex to the white vertices of the boundary of the face it belongs to. Okay, so you draw this, like this. Okay. Okay, and also for this one, this external one. Okay. And one more like this. Okay. So you see what I have done, okay? The red vertices have been connected to the white vertices in the boundary of their face, okay? And what you get, you start from a general planar map. And you get the red graph is a quadrangulation. Okay. It's easy to see on this example. You can see that all faces of the red planar map are of degree 4. Okay? Okay. So I'm not going to be more precise about that. It's just a brief motivation. I'm not going to use that. But for instance, this formula for the number of rooted quadrangulations is the same formula that you get if you look at all general planar maps with n edges. Okay? So you can also enumerate, for instance, general planar maps. Okay, so maybe I should now come to a more precise description of what I want to do here. So, what is the goal? Well, I'm going to choose Qn uniformly at random in my set script capital Qn. So I take one quadrangulation with n faces uniformly at random. Of course, I can do it because I have a finite set. Okay, I can just pick an element uniformly at random in this finite set. Okay, so this corresponds to essentially choosing a discrete model here of random geometry at random. Okay, I'm going to look at the vertex set, the set of all vertices. And I'm going to look at this as a metric space for the graph distance. Okay, so what is the graph distance? The graph distance between two vertices is the minimal number of edges on a path from the first vertex to the second one. So for instance, here, if you represent the graph distances, so let's represent the graph distances from root vertex in red. So it is at distance 0 from itself, of course. This one is at distance 1, at distance 2, 2. This is at distance 1. This one 2. This one is at distance 3. This one is at distance 4. Okay, you can very easily check that, for instance, for this vertex, you can go from the root vertex to this one by traversing 3 edges, and you cannot do less than 3. Okay, so you get this way a finite metric space. Let's say a random finite metric space. Okay? So why is it random? It's random because you have chosen Qn at random. Okay. And the goal is to show that these metric spaces are going to converge when I let the size of the quadrangulation tend to infinity towards a certain limit. Okay? Show that so I will need to put some rescaling here for the graph distance. And this will converge in distribution in some sense when n tends to infinity. Okay, so of course I need to explain the meaning of this convergence, to explain how we rescale the graph distance. So the rescaling here, so this will be for some a positive, and I can already tell you that it will be a equal 1/4. Why this rescaling is needed? It's because if you don't rescale the graph distance, if you want, you are going to blow up. Okay, the diameter of the metric space is going to tend to infinity, and you want to get a convergence in the sense of convergence of compact metric spaces. Okay. Okay. So maybe I should explain that now, just to say that this corresponds to what I said here, letting the size of the graph tend to infinity, and then getting a continuous model. Okay? So maybe before I state formally the result, I will explain to you in which sense we can hope to have a convergence here. So we need a notion of convergence of a sequence of metric spaces. And fortunately, this has been introduced and studied by Gromov and others later. And convergence of a sequence of metric spaces. So let me give you the definition. So I will consider two compact metric spaces. Then one can define what is called now the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. Between E1 and E2 is, so it's a very beautiful idea, and quite simple. So you have these two compact metric spaces. What you do, you try to embed them in the same big space isometrically, and then if you have done that, if you have embedded them in the same big space, well, you can use the usual Hausdorff distance to compare the embeddings. Okay, so what you do, you take an infimum over, well, the big space, I'm going to call it ED. I am going to embed E1 and E2 in capital E. So I will have mappings from E1 into E. I require this to be isometric. These are metric spaces. And similarly, I have psi2 from E2 into E. So they are both isometric. And now I can use what I write dE Haus. This is the Hausdorff distance between compact subsets of E to evaluate the distance between psi1 and E1 and psi2 of E2. Okay? So maybe I should recall what this means. If I have two compact subsets of E, say K and K prime, the Hausdorff distance between K and K prime is the smallest epsilon, the infimum of epsilon positive, such that K is contained in K prime epsilon, and K prime is contained in K epsilon, where this K epsilon means, if you want, the epsilon tubular neighborhood of K. Okay, the set of all points of capital E whose distance from K is smaller than epsilon. Okay. So this is the definition of the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. And what does it mean? So you have your two spaces, E1 and E2. Let's say this is E1, let's say this is E2. What you try to embed them simultaneously in an isometric way. This is very important. In such a way that if you want, you are going to, let's say that I draw an isometric copy E'1 of E1 in such a way that they are as close as possible in the sense of the Hausdorff metric on compact subsets of E, capital E. Okay, so this is quite a simple idea, and what's very nice is that this leads to something which is really a nice metric, a nice distance between compact metric spaces. Okay, and for instance, what you can prove is that if you look at the collection of all compact metric spaces, of course, as usual in geometry, you identify two spaces if they are isometric. Okay, so this is modulo isometries. Okay, and then this DGH. So somehow you may think that this object is very big, that you have many different compact metric spaces, but in fact not in some sense. This DGH defines a distance on capital K, and moreover you can check that K equips with DGH is a Polish space. It's both separable and complete. Okay? The fact that it is separable is not difficult to prove because, for instance, something you can check very easily is that finite metric spaces are dense in this set capital K. You can approximate any compact metric space by a finite subset in the sense of this metric. Okay? Of course, it's a bit more technical to get the completeness, but it's not completely obvious that you get a distance. This has also to be shown. So for all these facts, if you're interested in this, these are basic facts of metric geometry. You can look, there is a nice book by Bourago and Ivanov, which is called a course in metric geometry. Okay? Okay, so now we have a notion of convergence of a sequence of metric spaces. This will be simply the convergence in this space capital K here. Okay? And now I can come back to my problem here, and I can in fact state a theorem. Okay. So this is not a very old theorem. It's a result I obtained a few years ago, and there was an independent proof by Grégory Miermont, 2013. Okay. So remember what we did? We choose Qn uniformly at random in the set of all quadrangulations with n faces. And we look at the associated metric space, the vertex set equipped with the graph distance. So I'm going to rescale the graph distance, and essentially what is important is that we put here a power of n that tends to 0. So the rescaling factor here is n to the power minus 1/4. And in fact, I will also put a constant here, which is not very important. So this constant will be 9/8 to the power 1/4. And this converges in distribution at n tends to infinity towards a certain limit. Okay, I will call it m infinity d. So what is the meaning of this convergence? Well, I view these objects as random variables with values in my space capital K here, in my space of all compact metric spaces. This is a nice space. This is a Polish space. So I just have a convergence in distribution for random variables with values in a Polish space, which is a very standard setup in probability theory. So in distribution, in the space, K DGH. Okay, so these random metric spaces, they are viewed as random variables with values in this space here. Okay? So now what is the limit? So the limit m infinity is a random, well, it's a random variable again with values in this space, so it's a random compact metric space. And this is what we called the Brownian map. Okay, so basically these lectures I'm going to spend a lot of time explaining, well, the main steps, the main ideas at least of the proof of this convergence. And this will involve also certain considerations about trees. We will see that there is a close connection between planar maps and trees. So there will be, of course, other results. But basically, this is perhaps the main thing I want to discuss here. OK, so I should immediately mention that there are more general results than this, meaning that you do not need to deal with quadrangulations, because there is a similar result for triangulations, for instance. Okay? Or you can deal, for instance, with general planar maps. You can deal for instance, for models where you can have either triangles or quadrangles, where faces can have either degree 3 or degree 4, and so on. There are lots of models for which you will get the same convergence as this one. So the rescaling factor will always be this n to the power minus 1/4, but the constant here will depend on the model you consider. Okay? If you state this for triangulation, you get a different constant. Okay? So here I have chosen to put this constant because there is a kind of canonical way for defining the limit. Okay? And so if I want to get exactly the limit, I need to put a constant here. Otherwise, I would have to put the constant here, but I prefer to have this limiting object. Okay? So this means that in some sense the limiting object that we get is a universal. Okay, so something I think I already mentioned earlier. Here. No, I erased the bomb. Okay, when you construct a continuous model, you expect to have this universality that is going to be always the same limit independently of the details of the discrete model you start from. Okay? So this is the case here. Okay? For all these extensions, you get the same model. So I'm not going to give many references about that, but there are a number of people who have worked on extension of this convergence. Okay? Mirmont, for instance, but also Adario Berri, Albank, and many others. Okay? Okay, so I'm not saying that it is the only possible limit that you get. Essentially, you will get the same limit as long as you impose some restriction on the degree of faces. So you can put certain probability weights on your planar maps that will favor the appearance of very large faces. Of course, here it's not the case because my faces all have degree 4. But in a different model, you can try to have very large faces, and then in the limit, you would get something different. I think if you go to the lecture by Nicolas Curien tomorrow afternoon, he will mention this different limit. Physicists would say different universality class. Okay? But basically, the object that you get here corresponds to a scaling limit for all random planar maps where you impose some bound on the degree of faces. Okay. So just to finish this introduction, which was rather long, I want to explain to you what is the outline of the proof of such a result. Okay? So maybe I will, can you erase that? I will draw a diagram. So outline of proof. It's really a very sketchy outline, okay? So the idea is that these planar maps, these quadrangulations, are a rather complicated objects. It's not so easy to understand their geometry. And, okay. So what we're going to do, we are going to replace the quadrangulations I'm considering by a simpler object, which will be, we call them tau n, label tree. Okay, so we will see that there is a bijection, say a combinatorial bijection, between the set of all quadrangulations, say with a given number of faces, n, and the set of all labeled trees, which I will define in a while. Okay, so we are going to replace these objects, which are a bit complicated to study, by trees with labels, which are simpler objects. Okay? So if you want, in some sense, this is a kind of coding. Okay? We code a quadrangulation by a simpler object. And what is nice is that we can study now asymptotics of these objects when n tend to infinity. So this is convergence in distribution. We can state it in the Gromov-Hausdorff distance or in a in the sense which is a variant of the Gromov-Hausdorff convergence. This will converge to a certain continuous random tree. Which is the so-called CRT, which is also a very famous object in probability theory. And here, because you have labels, it will also be equipped with Brownian labels. Okay, so this is okay. This is, of course, this requires some work. Okay, and but it's basically things people have been doing now for 20 years. In the case of trees, this relies on well-known techniques. I will explain that in detail later. Now, from this limiting object, you can use also a kind of coding. Basically, what you do, you do in the continuous setting the analog of this coding here in the discrete setting. Of course, it's a bit different in the continuous setting, but you can basically, from this object, you can define what I've called the Brownian map. Okay, so there's a constructive way, starting from this probabilistic object, which is quite well understood, to construct the limit that we expect to get there. Okay? And now, in some sense, we have to say that the diagram is commutative and something like that, meaning that you can get now these convergences. So, of course, that's the hard point, okay? Because, well, it's not easy. Well, of course, we use this convergence here, but this convergence does not give enough information to get this one, which is what we get, what we want to get. Okay? So roughly speaking, what I'm going to do in the lectures, I'm going to explain to you the bijections. That's going to be a lot of combinatorics, but this will be not too long, I hope. Spend some time explaining this also. So this is of independent interest, in fact. This is independently of the theory of random planar maps. I will explain to you this coding, how you can get the Brownian map from this object here, and give a few ideas of the proof of this, which I could not do in the full details because it's quite long, in fact. It took a lot of time to arrive at what we really want to get here. Okay, so I will start now by describing the coding by trees. I'm not going many references, but probably I should also mention here that there are further developments, very recent, not yet published, in fact, due to Jason Miller and Scott Sheffield, which are interested in the conformal structure of the Brownian map. Okay, so basically what they claim to do is to construct a conformal structure on this object. I'm not going to explain precisely what this means, but essentially, as far as I understand, the idea is to construct this object in terms of a random metric on the sphere with certain conformal invariance properties. Okay, but I'm not going to describe that. This is very recent. Okay? There are several papers in the recent years, maybe 2,000 pages of papers, and I have not read all that. So, but I want to mention because it's really something which is related to these developments.
Excuse me, but do we have an idea how Brownian map looks like? So we prove that we can do it.
I should have shown you a picture. There are very nice pictures by Nicolas that Nicolas will show tomorrow in his lecture. You have to go to his lecture. But I wanted to give the lecture on Blackboard, so I. But on my computer there are nice pictures. Yeah. Either I show them to you tomorrow, or Nicolas will show them in his lecture. Okay? Because in fact, it's a beautiful object. Yeah. But these are not really I should say, these are not pictures of the Brownian map. These are pictures of very large quadrangulations, which one expects to be close to the Brownian map. Any other question? Okay, so today, well, I will do some combinatorics. So maybe I can erase that. We will use the Gromov-Harsdorff distance later. And in fact, we will use a different definition than this one, which I will explain. Okay? Because this definition is very nice, very intuitive, but it's not so easy to work with this definition. Okay? So Gromov had a different definition, which is more tractable. So I will explain that later. Okay, so this was introduction. So maybe second part of the lecture, I'm going to explain the coding of quadrangulation by trees. Okay, so I'm sorry this will be mostly combinatorics, but I promise to you that tomorrow you will have more probability theory. Okay, so I need to a notion of trees, and the trees I'm going to use are called the plane trees, I think, in combinatorics, or planar trees. Okay, so perhaps I introduce some notation. I will write script capital U for the set, the union from n equals 0 to infinity of the set of positive integers to the power n. And so n is only positive integers. And I have here n to the power 0. So basically, an element in this set will be viewed as a word, if you want, made of integers. And in n to the power 0, I have only the empty word, which I denote by this symbol, empty set. Okay? So if I have an element U of this set, script capital U, say of n to the power n, or the integer n corresponds to the length of the word, if you want. I will write it as this way. And if U, okay, so let's say U is equal to U1, U2, etc., UN. Okay, so that's the components. And I will use the notation for any j belonging to n. I will write uj, well, simply for the word obtained by adding j at the end. Okay. Okay. So all this is notation. And I will use a language of genealogy to speak about these things. So uj will be child of u, or u the parent of uj. Okay. Okay, so I can now define plane tree. A plane tree, let's call it tau, is just a finite subset of a script capital U, such that I require that always the empty word belongs to tau. The empty word should be viewed as the ancestor, if you want, of the tree. So if uj belongs to tau, then u belongs to tau. The parent of any vertex belongs to tau. And if u belongs to tau, there exists an integer which I call ku of tau, which is non-negative, such that uj belongs to tau if and only if j is between 1 and ku of 2. Okay, so it's formal definition, but of course the object is very easy to understand on a picture. Essentially what you have your tree always contains the ancestor, the empty world. It has a certain number of children. So the children are called 1, 2, 3, for instance, and so on. One can have, say, for instance, one child. I will call it 1, 1. 3 can have 2 children. 3, 1, 3, 2, and so on. For instance, this is 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay, so it's more or less obvious definition. And but something which is important in this definition is that you have an order. Okay, so instead of saying plain tree, one also says rooted ordered tree. So rooted because you always have this distinguished vertex, the root here. And ordered because you see on the children of every individual, you have an order, of course. They are enumerated 1, 2, 3. And so, okay? So this means also that you can define a kind of contour of the tree. You can imagine that you explore the tree starting from the root, from the ancestor, and moving up and down along the branches like this. Okay? And of course, it's something you can do precisely because your tree is ordered. You can go from the left to the right. I should say, when I draw the tree in the plane like this, or imagine it could be on the sphere also, okay, I always list the children from left to right. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's okay. So these are very trivial things, but in a sense, that's going to be important. Okay. Something I'm going to use is the notion of corner of a tree. So, what is a corner of toe? A corner of toe is, if you want, it's an angular sector between two successive edges around a vertex. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Take this example here. Take, for instance, the ancestor. Well, there are 3 corners associated with the ancestor. Because you have this corner here, this one here, and this one here. Okay? Here you have 2 corners, this one and this one. Here you just have one, okay, and so on. Okay? So basically, with each vertex, you can associate a number of corners, which is the number of children. It corresponds to the degree of the vertex, if you want, in the tree. Okay, so.
Is it oriented or not?
Is it?
Oriented or not?
No. Well, you can orient it, because I will always go around in clockwise order on the tree. So if you want, you can imagine that your corners are oriented. But no, here you have 3 corners here. Okay, just no. Okay, and what happens is that when you explore the tree as I explained, like this, you are going to visit not only all vertices, but you are going to visit all corners. Okay? You see, you start from the corner below here of the root, but then you come back here, you visit this one, here, and so on. Okay? Okay, so maybe I can formalize a little bit this idea of so how many corners do you have? No, so if a toe has n vertices, okay, so maybe I will introduce a definition. So script capital Tn would be the set of all plane trees with n, not n vertices, but n edges. Okay, so edges are, okay, I did not define it, but it's more or less obvious. I have an edge between each individual and its parent, okay, as represented here. Okay, so if 2 has n edges, so n edges means the same as n plus 1 vertices. Very easy to check for a tree. So if 2 has n edges, it has 2n corners. Okay, I leave that as an exercise. It's quite easy. Okay, so what you can do then, you can formalize a little bit more this exploration of the tree. So I will write V0, V1, V2n, what I will call the contour sequence of the tree. So what will it be? Well, it's really what you get if you do this exploration and you record the vertices that you are visiting. Okay, so you always start with V0. V0 is always equal to the empty world. So V1 here is going to be this vertex here. V2 is going to be 1, 1. But then you go down, so you again visit this vertex. So this is the same as V3. Then you visit this one, so this is the same as V4. Then V5 is equal to 2, and so on. Okay, so you can make this more precise if you want. You start with V0 is always equal to the empty world, and for say I between 0 and 2n minus 1, Vi plus 1 is the first child of Vi that you have not visited before, so not in V0, it is not in V0 Vi, or if there is no such child, then it's a parent of Vi. Okay? So it's just another way of describing what I said here. Okay, and you check that this definition makes sense for I between 0 and 2n minus 1, and that at the step 2n you have returned to the root this V2n, so both, this is the root, and this is the root also. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to make this precise because that's going to be important for the definition I'm going to give now. So before I give this definition, maybe I should add one more definition here. So a labeled tree, so is a pair, well, that consists of a tree, tau, and a collection LV V belonging to tau. These are going to be labels assigned to the vertices of tau. So where tau is a plane tree, and LV, the labels are integers, possibly negative or positive. It can be any sign, such that you always require that the label of the root is equal to 0. And if you have two vertices that are adjacent, the difference of the label can be at most 1 in absolute value. Sorry?
At most or equal?
Oh, at most, thank you. Can be 0, yeah. Sorry. So adjacent means that they are connected by an edge. So this means that V is the parent of V prime, or conversely, V prime is the parent of V. Okay? So if you think of my picture here, I can put the labels in red if you want. So you have always 0 here. You can have here, for instance, label 1. You can have -1 here. You can have 0. You can have maybe 1 and 2 here. You can have -1 here and maybe -2 here. Okay? So this assignment satisfies. I made a mistake?
+2.
Oh, no, it's okay, +2. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, otherwise it does not work. So these definitions may look, well, for the moment a bit strange, but we will see the relevance in a while. Meaning that I introduce another definition, or notation if you want. So now capital Tn is a set of all labeled trees with n edges. Okay? So here is so recall, I think I erased the definition. I had this Qn dot, which was a set of all rooted and pointed quadrangulation with n faces. So theorem, which is usually attributed to Schaeffer, but it was, in fact, there was a first version before due to Corey and Vauquelin. It says that one can construct a bijection from the set, this set capital Tn, onto the set of all quadrangulations, Qn, with the n faces, which has, this is already an interesting fact, the fact that both these sets have the same cardinality. This will give you, in fact, a way of computing the cardinality of this set. Okay. But we have much more, such that if you, maybe I will give a name to this bijection, capital theta, such that if you start, if you construct a quadrangulation Q as the image under theta of a labeled tree, well, basically you are going to be able to identify vertices of Q. Okay, I should say all vertices of Q except for the distinguished vertex. I forgot maybe to introduce this notation. I will wrote the distinguished vertex of Q, I will call it partial D. Okay, are identified two vertices of tau. And moreover, in this identification, there is something very nice, which is you can interpret certain graph distances in the quadrangulation in terms of labels on the tree tau. Okay? So essentially, if you look at the graph distance between the distinguished vertex, which I've called partial D, and another vertex V. So this is a graph distance in Q, I insist on that, and in the quadrangulation. This corresponds essentially to the label of V, except that you need to make a shift. Okay? So you need to subtract the minimal label in tau and to add +1. Okay. So this is very interesting for us because we want to understand, this is a theorem I stated before, the quadrangulation as a metric space. So we want to understand graph distances in our quadrangulation. Okay? And here what you see is that at least certain graph distances, namely those from the distinguished vertex, are related in a very simple way to the labels on the tree. And a labeled tree is not that a complicated object. We will analyze it tomorrow. It's something we understand quite well. So we will well understand at least the distances from this particular vertex partial T. Of course, it's not sufficient if you want to get Gromov-Hausdorff convergence. You need more, but still it's an important first step. Okay, I will explain to you the bijection. I'm not going to prove this because it's really combinatorics, and this is not a course about combinatorics. Well, it would be interesting, but I want to explain to you how the bijection is constructed, because that's going to be useful also later. Okay, so construction of the bijection. So I start from, maybe I will not take any tree, I will take a nice one. Yeah, this one should be nice. Well, you can do it, of course, for any tree, but the picture sometimes becomes a bit difficult to draw. So I take this is my tree, so maybe I have one vertex here, maybe two like this. Okay, so I could put the name of the vertices as I did here, but I really don't need to do that. Once I have drawn the tree like this, well, it's clear what it is. Okay, so, because of what I said earlier, you know, vertices are listed from the left to right. And so. Okay, so then I need to put the labels. That's important. Take this stroke here. So you always have 0 here. So let's say, for instance, you have -1 here. You have 0 here, 1 here, -1. Let's say 2 here, 0, -1, 1. Okay? So that's my tree, okay? This object here is what we call plain tree, and I have put also the labels. Okay? And now I'm going to draw the image of this object under my bijection capital theta, and this will give me a quadrangulation Q. Okay? So what I do first, I redraw exactly the same tree, but I will put the edges in dashed lines, because now I'm going to draw other edges corresponding to the quadrangulation, which a priori have nothing to do with I'm missing one edge here, which have nothing to do with the edges of the tree. Okay, so this is just the same tree with the dashed lines, and okay, I repeat the labels also: 0, -1, 1, 0, -1, 2, 0, -1, and so on. Okay, so the first thing you do, you add an extra vertex. And this is the one I'm going to call partial D. It's going to be, say, anywhere, but imagine it's here. Okay? Oh, I should have mentioned that here, how many vertices do you have for Q? Well, we saw that earlier. We have n plus 2 vertices if Q has n faces. And here, how many vertices do we have for tau? We have n plus 1 vertices. Okay. So of course, this is consistent with the fact that I identify here these vertices, except for one, so the vertices of tau. N plus 2 minus 1 is n plus 1. So what do? We explore the tree, as I explained to you before, like this. And in this way, we visit all corners of the tree. Okay? And each time we visit a corner, we are going to connect each corner of tau, so say with label L, to the next corner with label L minus 1. Okay, so I start from the root, which has label 0, and I will connect it to the next corner with label minus 1, but it's going to be here, okay? So I drew an edge like that, okay? So you do this, you want, okay, around the tree. And then I continue, you know, I arrive at this corner here of this vertex, okay? And I connect this corner What I mean when I say I connect this corner, I mean I draw an edge which starts in the corner I'm considering. Okay? I connect it to the next -1. Okay? Then I arrive at a corner with label -1, and in this example you see that -1 is the minimal label on the tree. So I cannot find a corner with label -2. Okay? So I cannot do what I explained that. Okay? So I should have said also, if L is equal to the minimal label, I connect, of course, not to the next corner with label L-1, but I connect to partial T. Okay, so this is the case here. So I connect this one here to partial T. Okay, and then I go down. Okay, so now when I go down, I visit another corner of a vertex I already visited. Okay, and you have to think that when I say next here, it means sometimes in cyclic order around the tree. I should have mentioned that there is a cyclic order on corners which is induced by this exploration around the tree. Okay? So when I am at this corner, which has label 0, the next corner, I continue going like this. The next -1 I meet is this one. Okay? So I draw an edge like this. Okay? Then I go down again, I have a corner 0. The next -1 is here, like this. Now I am at this I have only one corner here, -1. I have to connect it to the next -2. There is no -2, so I connect it to partial D. I go down, I arrive at this corner. 0, I have to connect it to the next -1, which is far away. It is here. 1, I have to connect it to the next 0, which is here. 2 to the next 1, 1 to the next 0. I have another corner here of 2. Okay, now I'm arriving here if you want. So 2 to the next 1, which is here. 1 to the next 0. -1 to partial D. This corner 0 to the next -1, which is here. This corner 1 to the next 0. And that's all. Now I visited all the corners, you see? So I draw all these edges, and the miracle is that now the orange graph I get is a quadrangulation. You see this face has degree 4, this one 2, the external face has degree 4. I forgot one. I forgot one edge, too bad. What is my mistake? Oh, I forgot when I was coming here. This 0 was connected to this -1. I'm sorry. I forgot the edge that starts from this corner here. When I do the picture on the blackboard, I always forget at least one edge. But now it's okay. I have 4 edges and so on, but then it's okay, I'm almost finished. So this is a bijection. So it has a distinguished vertex. I need to say that, well, where is the root edge? And now I realized I made a mistake. You have to correct this. It's Tn times the pair consisting of -1 and +1. So here I need also to choose a sign epsilon in -1 +1. And this sign is only used to decide the orientation of the root edge. So the root edge is always going to be the edge that starts from the first corner of the root. So the root edge is going to be this one here. It's the first edge I draw, if you want. But I have to decide its orientation. So there are 2 possible choices. And according to the value of epsilon, I can orient it this way or this way. Okay. So for instance, if epsilon equals +1, you can decide that the origin will be the root of the tree. That will be oriented this way. So perhaps the last thing I want to do is why do we have this property here? Okay. Well, it's quite clear that from the way you draw all the edges, that an edge of the quadrangulation Q connects V and V prime with LV minus LV prime equals 1 in the absolute value. Okay, because you always look for the next corner with label L minus 1. Okay, Q should be capital Q. Okay, so this means that if you want to go from one vertex, say for instance this one to partial D, well, you are at label 2, but the only vertices to be connected to partial D are those with label minus 1, with this label here, the minimal label. And so you must first go from label 2 to label minus 1. And at each step, you can decrease the label by at most 1. Okay. So it's very easy to see that the minimal number of edges you need to go to partial D will be this quantity, at least. And it is, in fact, exactly this quantity. Because what you can do, starting from any vertex, say, for instance, do 2, this one with label 2, you look for the next vertex with label 1. Okay? So you know you have an edge here. From this one, you look for the next vertex with label 0. So you have an edge again by definition. From this 0, you look for the next vertex with label minus 1. You arrive here. And then you arrive at partial D with one more edge. So in this way, you draw, in fact, a geodesic. So you just follow, if you want, the rule here. You iterate, if you want. Each time, you look for the next vertex. In fact, it's the next corner. You have some choice in the corner you start from, but you have at least always one such corner. And you draw this path from the vertex to partial D, which has exactly this length. Okay, so this is not at all difficult to prove. What is more difficult to prove is that this construction gives you a bijection, but that I will not do. Maybe I will explain a little more tomorrow, but I'm not sure. Okay, I should stop now. It's time. Thank you for your attention.